In the early 1960s, Ford of Britain had a problem. Not the sort of problem companies usually worry about, like falling sales or outdated cars. Quite the opposite, in fact. Ford was wildly successful. The Anglia was everywhere. The Cortina was becoming one of the best-selling cars in Britain, and the Zephyr and Zodiac dominated the executive market. But success had created a gap. If you were a young manager, a salesman on the rise, or someone who had just got promoted and wanted a car to show it, Ford didn't really have anything for you. The Cortina was too basic, the Zephyr was too expensive and too big, and the Consul Classic, which sat in between, wasn't exactly flying out of showrooms. Ford needed a car for the growing middle class, a car for the motorway age, a car that looked expensive, modern, American, but still affordable to build. The solution would be one of the most distinctive cars of the 1960s, a car inspired by American styling, built on Cortina mechanicals, powered by a controversial engine, and ultimately killed by Ford's own success. This is the Ford Corsair story. To understand the Corsair, you have to understand Ford of Britain in the early 1960s. At the time, Ford UK and Ford Germany were still largely separate companies, each developing their own cars. Ford UK had the Anglia, the Cortina, Zephyr and the Zodiac. Ford of Germany had the Taunus range. Ford's UK range looked good on paper, but there was a pricing gap between the Cortina and the Zephyr that competitors were starting to fill. Vauxhall had the Victor and the Cresta, Rootes had the Hillman Super Minx, BMC had the Oxford and the Cambridge. Ford needed something in that middle space. They'd already tried with the Consul Classic and the Consul Capri, but they hadn't been a hit with customers. They were expensive to build and had unusual styling, especially the reverse rake rear window. Dealers struggled to sell them. So, by the early 1960s, Ford management decided that they needed a replacement. But there was a major constraint on this: money. Ford had just spent big developing the Cortina, and that car was their priority. Any new mid-range car would have to be developed cheaply and quickly. So instead of developing a completely new car, Ford decided to base the new car on the Cortina. The floor pan, suspension layout, and many mechanical components would be shared. The wheelbase was stretched slightly, the track widened, and a completely new body placed on top. This approach saved huge amounts of development money and allowed Ford to sell the car at a higher price than a Cortina while still making a good profit. Some engineers inside Ford weren't happy about this though. They wanted a proper new car to take the fight to arch-rival Vauxhall with their Victor, but the finance department won the argument. The car had to be cheap to develop. This tension between styling ambition and engineering budget would follow the Corsair right from its very beginning. If the engineering was going to be a Cortina, then the styling had to do the heavy lifting to sell this car. The car needed to look expensive, modern and different enough that customers wouldn't realise how much the Cortina was underneath it. At the time, American car styling was hugely influential around the world. Ford designers in Britain looked particularly at the early 1960s Ford Thunderbird, especially the models with the pointed nose and clean sides. These cars looked futuristic, like jet aircraft about to take off. So the new Ford got a very distinctive pointed front end with recessed headlights and a long front overhang. From some angles, it looked sleek and modern. From others, it looked slightly odd, as if the front of the car was longer than it needed to be. This styling decision actually created engineering challenges. That long nose meant the front overhang was large, and visually the wheels looked too far back in the body because, well, that was it, because it was based on the Ford Cortina. When the car was revealed in 1963, people definitely noticed it. Whether they liked it or not was another question, but it definitely stood out. The Ford Corsair launched at the London Motor Show at the end of 1963 and sat neatly between the Cortina and the Zephyr in Ford's range. It was originally known as the Consul Corsair, as it was replacing the Consul Classic, but the Consul name would eventually be dropped. The Corsair had more interior space than the Cortina, more equipment and more presence on the road. Inside, the dashboard had wood trim and more luxurious materials, and the driving position felt more like a larger car. At launch, the Corsair used the familiar Ford Kent inline-4 engines, mainly the 1500cc unit also used in the Cortina. Performance was adequate but not exciting, but then the Corsair was never intended to be a sports car. It was supposed to be a comfortable motorway cruiser for Britain's new motorways, and with them being unregulated at the time, the top speed of 110 miles an hour on some models must have been exhilarating at the time. Other than a few reservations about the dashboard, the press generally liked the car and sales started strong. The car looked expensive and modern, and many buyers liked the American styling. But Ford already had another plan for the Corsair, and it involved a rather unusual engine. In the mid-1960s, Ford was experimenting with new engine designs in Europe. Ford Germany developed a V4 engine for the Taunus range and for the Ford Transit van. This engine was compact and produced good torque for its size. Ford decided to introduce this V4 engine into the Corsair in 1965. On paper, the V4 seemed like a clever idea. Because the engine was shorter than the traditional inline engine, it allowed more room in the engine bay and could potentially improve weight distribution and packaging. But V4 engines have an inherent problem: vibration. Unlike inline engines, they aren't naturally balanced, so Ford had to fit a balance shaft to reduce vibrations. Even with this though, the engine was never particularly smooth. Owners often noticed vibration at idle and a slightly rough engine note. It wasn't terrible, but it didn't feel as refined as the competition, or as a Cortina. It was made even worse by Ford's marketing blurb that marketed the V4 as the car that is seen but not heard.
Smooth, silent V-Power. Corsair V4.
It provided more torque and suited relaxed cruising quite well, so it wasn't a complete disaster. In fact, Saab used the same engine in the 96 very successfully for many years. Like most Fords, the Corsair was available in many different versions. There were basic models, deluxe versions, GT versions, and in 1967 the more luxurious Corsair 2000E, which had more equipment, better trim and a larger engine, and was pitched against the Rover 2000. The GT was slightly sportier with improved suspension and instruments like a rev counter. There was also an estate, but not built by Ford themselves. Instead, they were converted by coach builder Abbott of Farnham. If you wanted something even more glamorous, Crayford would convert your Corsair into a convertible. These cars looked fantastic, but removing the roof from a car that wasn't designed to be a convertible made them quite flexible, and being a custom conversion, they weren't cheap. With Corsairs zipping up and down the motorways at 110 miles an hour, it's maybe not surprising that the Corsair became popular with British police forces, particularly traffic police and the flying squad. It was reasonably quick, had plenty of interior space, and most importantly, it looked quite intimidating in a rearview mirror with its pointed nose and quad headlights. The biggest threat to the Corsair didn't come from Vauxhall or BMC, it came from inside Ford. In 1966, Ford launched the Cortina Mark II. This new Cortina was bigger, more modern looking, and available in a huge range of versions, from basic family cars to the Lotus performance models shielded to great effect by Jim Clark, and luxury versions that started to overlap heavily with the Corsair. The new Cortina offered similar interior space, similar performance, but it was cheaper. And so customers started asking a simple question: why buy a Corsair when you can buy a Cortina? This internal competition slowly killed the Corsair. Ford realised they didn't really need two cars in the same part of the market. The Cortina was a better seller by a huge margin, so it made more sense to move the Cortina slightly up market rather than continue with the Corsair. By the end of the 1960s, the decision had effectively been made. The Corsair wouldn't get a direct replacement. Instead, in 1970, Ford made the Cortina even bigger, again with American styling. The larger size wasn't only good to get Corsair customers, it wrong-footed British Leyland, whose Morris Marina had been produced to compete with the smaller, older Ford Cortina. The Corsair name would get one more outing in Australia in 1989 when it was used on a rebadged Nissan Pintara, also known as the Bluebird. It would only last 3 years. The Ford Corsair is interesting because it represents a very Ford way of building cars. It looked like a completely different car, something stylish and almost American, but underneath it was closely related to the humble Cortina. It filled a gap in the market at exactly the right time during the growth of the British middle class and the motorway age. It sold reasonably well, looked distinctive, and gave Ford valuable experience in building slightly more upmarket cars for the European market. And with 310,000 sold, this reworked Cortina must have surely made a profit. But ultimately, it was killed off by the success of its own little brother, the Cortina. The Corsair may not have been as famous as the Cortina or as prestigious as the Zodiac, but for a few years in the 1960s, if you wanted to look like a junior executive on the way to an important meeting on the M1, the Ford Corsair was the car to own. If you want to learn all about the Ford Cortina, that video's on the right. Thanks for watching to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.